Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel for another video where today I wanted to do something a little bit different. Ever since I filmed my video on Kitty Genovese and the bystander effect, I've fallen into a bit of a rabbit hole of researching human and psychological experiments, and today I want to share with you 8 of the most insane ones that I've come across. If you're particularly interested in any of these stories, maybe I'll do a full video on them at some point if there's enough information available, maybe. But please let me know what you think of this kind of format and if this is something you'd want to see again. There's so many cases and stories I've gone to cover over the years, only to realise that there's barely enough information available for a 5-minute video on them. So this kind of format could be a good occasional option. But before we get into this video, I just want to take a moment to thank this week's sponsor, HelloFresh. You guys have no idea how excited I was when I saw this email drop into my inbox, because I have used and loved HelloFresh for literal years, and here is my recipe book to prove it. Like, this isn't even all of the recipes I've tried over the years. These are just the cards from the ones I loved and want to eat again and again and again. I use this recipe book like every day. There's so much in here. When I first moved out of my parents' home about 3.5 years ago now, I realised that I did not know how to cook anything apart from cheesy pasta. So I figured then that I'd try HelloFresh for a couple of weeks and sort of like get my bearings, but I ended up just loving it and I've never stopped using it since. That's 3.5 years of being a hardcore HelloFresh fan. HelloFresh provide meal kits straight to your front door every single week. You don't have to think too much about it, they do all of the hard work for you, and you can just enjoy the cooking, most of which only takes around 30 minutes. They have so many delicious recipes to choose from. I am a self-confessed very fussy eater, and even I never struggle to find meals I like on HelloFresh. It saves time and stress, it removes stressful meal planning and trips to the supermarket from your week. It's super flexible, you can add extra dinners or lunches when you need them, or you can skip weeks entirely, no problem, or change your delivery day to what works best for you. And I've noticed as well that I barely waste any food. HelloFresh just provide the perfect amount of ingredients for each meal, which is A, great for the environment, and B, great for me not having to take the bins out too often. HelloFresh's carbon footprint is 25% lower than that of meals made from store-bought groceries, which is something I never knew but makes me feel even better about my choices. And in 2020, HelloFresh donated over 4 million meals to charity and are continuing to step up the food donations amid the coronavirus crisis. I just love this company, you guys. If you're interested in trying them out, and I highly recommend that you do, go to hellofresh.com and use my code GeorgiaMarie10 to get 10 free meals, including free shipping. 10 free meals, that's incredible. And you can use this code to unlock another special offer in select global markets. And without further ado, let's get into 8 of the craziest and the most interesting human experiments in history. Some of which changed our understanding of medicine, science and psychology. Others were just plain cruel and unnecessary. Or maybe even if they did change or help our understanding of something, does that mean that they're ethically okay and morally okay? That's for you to decide. We're getting deep already. And where is better to start with a video like this than with a bit of Sigmund Freud? And with one of the tamer experiments in this video, we're going to sort of build up here. We've all heard of Sigmund Freud, I'm sure. He's widely regarded as the founding father of psychoanalysis. He believed in any number of crazy things, some of which are still believed and practiced today. Others are crazy controversial. I won't go into it all here. Most of us are going to go into this knowing who Freud is. This is about Sigmund Freud and Emma Eckstein, who is an Austrian author. What took place with Emma is one of the strangest acts of medical malpractice in documented history. And luckily for us, it was very well documented because both of the doctors involved, one of whom was Freud, corresponded about this case at length. And the letters have survived the century. This one has a bit of everything. We have strange treatment, negligence, patient blaming, cover-ups, and a good old dose of sexism. Our story actually begins with a doctor called Wilhelm Fliess, who was this successful ear, nose and throat surgeon in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. He had any number of crazy theories about the human body and psychology, one of my favourites of which is that the idea he had that everyone is bisexual, which of course I just kind of love. But the relevant theory here is one he came up with about nasal reflex neurosis. Fliess somehow became convinced that there was a connection between the nose, the genitals and the brain, and this link apparently led to a variety of neurological and psychological symptoms. He thought that nasal infections could lead to menstrual disorders and infertility. So Fliess contacted his good friend Sigmund Freud in Vienna, who at the time wasn't a very well-known physician. He was actually having trouble making his name in neurology. When Fliess told Freud about his nasal reflex neurosis theory, Freud was of course fascinated. He actually had a 27-year-old patient called Emma Eckstein who'd been suffering from irregular and heavy periods amongst other problems that he had diagnosed as hysteria. Yes, because back in the 1800s, any illness suffered by a female had to be caused by hysteria. And what had caused said hysteria, you ask? Well, nothing less than excess masturbation, of course. After hearing about Fliess's theory, Freud decided to introduce the two, and in 1895, Fliess travelled to Vienna to meet Emma. He decided that the root of Emma's issue was her nasal passage, of course, and decided to operate, removing her turbinate bone. But of course, the surgery didn't go as planned, and Fliess actually made a mistake that caused Emma some pretty horrific complications. She was hemorrhaging and her nose was leaking this horrible smelling discharge. By this point, Fliess had already left the country, so she goes to see Freud, who called in a specialist who inserted a drain into her nose, but this drain literally wouldn't go in. Instead, they actually pulled out some blood clots and found something similar to a thread hanging down out of her nose. They pulled it and it just kept on coming. Fliess had accidentally left half a metre of gauze in Emma's nose. And upon removal of this gauze, Emma literally stopped breathing. She turned white, so they quickly had to repack the nose with fresh gauze and figure out where to go from there. Freud was actually so horrified that he ran from the room because he couldn't stand to be around it. It was disgusting. And this would only be the beginning of Emma's problems. They tried to remove the gauze a month later, but she hemorrhaged again, so they had to repack it. And then again and again. This cycle continued for months. They couldn't remove this gauze without Emma being at risk of bleeding out, but she was also at risk of having infections by just having it up there. It was months and months till Emma had any kind of relief until she stopped bleeding. Fliess oversaw all of this from a distance, and Freud actually told him not to worry about it. This mistake could happen to anyone. And he told Emma that all of the problems with the operation were her fault, that she was hemorrhaging because she was wish bleeding, caused by how much she longed for the affection of others. Freud actually wrote in a letter to Fliess on the 4th of May 1896, writing, "I am taking notes of her history so I can send it to you. So far I know only that she bled out of longing. She has always been a bleeder when cutting herself and in similar circumstances. As a child, she suffered from severe nosebleeds. During the years when she was not yet menstruating, she had headaches which were interpreted to her as malingering and which in truth had been generated by suggestion. For this reason, she joyously welcomed her severe menstrual bleeding as proof that her illness was genuine, a proof that was also recognised as such by others. She described a scene from the age of 15 in which she suddenly began to bleed from the nose, when she had the wish to be treated by a certain young doctor who was present, and who also appeared to her in the dream. When she saw how affected I was by her first hemorrhage, she experienced this as the realisation of an old wish to be loved in her illness, and in spite of the danger during the succeeding hours, she felt happy as never before." Of course, as far as Freud was concerned, there could be no actual medical reason for why she bled so much, such as a blood clotting disorder or a congenital bleeding disorder or something along those lines. Nope, Freud thought she was so desperate for attention that she made herself bleed. Emma's face was left awfully disfigured from all this trauma to her nose. Her nasal bone had literally been chiselled away and one side of her face was caved in. From the day of her operation, she barely left the house ever again. She couldn't walk and eventually died from a stroke in 1924, almost 30 years later. Freud did his best to cover up this malpractice for years. Even when decades later correspondence between Freud and Fliess was made public, everything mentioning Emma's case was redacted, only made public in 1985, 90 years after all this happened. Fliess would go down after his death as being known as an eccentric doctor, but Freud's part of the story was never really well known. He enabled Fliess, he let it all happen and then blamed it on Emma. all because this one single man had an inkling that the nasal passage was linked to the genitals. Even after Emma's menstrual bleeding clearly didn't stop after her operation, it was her fault because she was so desperate for attention, and it's not that Fliessa's theory was a load of rubbish at all. Poor Emma had to be the one to pay for a man's completely misguided theory. And the craziest thing is she actually trusted Freud so much that even after she recovered as much as she actually could, she became a psychoanalyst herself for a while and worked with Freud, exploring the area of sexual and social hygiene in young girls. Next, let's talk about an experiment wonderfully titled Dr. William Beaumont and the Stomach, an experiment which took place in 1822. Dr. William Beaumont was an army surgeon from New England who was working at Fort Mackinac in northern Michigan at the time. Beaumont had proven his skills as a surgeon working all throughout the War of 1812 after just 1 year of apprenticeship. Fort Mackinac was quiet compared to what he'd had to deal with in the war, and it was a very popular place for fur trapping at the time, meaning there were still plenty of gunshot wounds going around for Beaumont to deal with. One day in 1822, Beaumont gets an urgent summoning from the local fur shop. An either 19 or 28-year-old French-Canadian man, his age isn't entirely clear, called Alexis St Martin had been accidentally shot with a shotgun and needed urgent medical attention. It was a very bad wound, with his lung literally hanging out through the wound and the contents of his breakfast all over his clothes. He wasn't expected to survive the night, but Beaumont operated and managed to remove all of the metal that was in the wound. Against all odds, Alexis managed to survive. Over the coming weeks, he would have to endure several more operations to fix his injuries, which I'm sure was traumatic enough in a time before anaesthesia. Eventually, he recovered entirely, apart from a gaping fistula that formed on his side. A fistula is described as an arboreal connection between vessels or organs that do not usually connect. In Alexis's case, this was a hole in his skin and muscles straight through to his stomach. You could literally look into his stomach from the outside of his body. For the first couple of weeks, they really struggled to administer any medication or food to Alexis because it would just spill out of this hole in his side. So he had to be fed through anal injections for a couple of weeks. Despite all of Beaumont's attempts, this hole never closed up. It did get smaller, so Alexis could begin to eat again as long as the hole was covered with a bandage, but it never closed completely. It was there for the rest of his life, just about a shilling-sized hole through his body. Apparently, the strong stomach acids basically disinfected the wound from the inside out, meaning that Alexis would never really suffer with any infections in this area. It was just there. Despite healing almost entirely, Alexis could no longer safely go back to work as a fur trapper, so Beaumont hired him as a handyman. It made sense, Alexis was working and Beaumont could keep an eye on the wound and make sure it was clean every day. But then Beaumont gets an idea. What if he could use this wound and watch the process of digestion at work? Or it might be the other way around. It might be that Beaumont actually offered Alexis the job in exchange for using him as a walking, talking medical experiment. We don't really know. Either way, Alexis worked for Beaumont, Beaumont poked at the hole. Either way, for the next 2 decades, the two men would live together, with Beaumont analysing everything that went in and out of Alexis's stomach. But why did Beaumont want to do this, I hear you ask? Well, at the time, nobody really understood digestion and there were a lot of different theories going around. Short of cutting into live people to watch the stomach at work, there weren't really many ways that medical professionals could figure out what was going on inside the body. And there weren't many people who willingly wanted to be cut open into a time before both antiseptic and anaesthesia. Some doctors thought digestion was caused by muscular contractions. Others thought the food just sat in the stomach and slowly rotted. I'm not sure anyone really thought that chemicals, digestive enzymes, were responsible for the breakdown of food, but Beaumont soon realised that this was exactly what was going on. He tested the stomach in many different ways, sometimes spooning food in and then siphoning it out, sometimes dangling pieces of meat on strings into the hole and pulling out the remains. He could see clear as day that there was some kind of chemical dissolving this food. He took samples of gastric secretions often and sent them to chemists for analysis. He managed to prove without a doubt that digestion was a chemical process, thanks to the gastric juice that Beaumont suspected correctly to be hydrochloric acid. He also noticed the connection between digestion and disease, noting that Alexis's digestion slowed considerably when he was sick. Beaumont eventually released his full findings in a paper entitled Experiments and Observations on the Gastric Juice and the Physiology of Digestion. But actually, it wasn't so much as a paper than it was a 280-page book. But exactly how did Alexis St Martin feel about being used as a human guinea pig? I can imagine it was a lot of mixed feelings. He actually left Beaumont for good in 1834, 12 years after the injury. I'm sure he kind of felt grateful to Beaumont for saving his life and giving him a job and a home. Before the injury, Alexis was said to be an angry alcoholic. He wasn't particularly well liked in his job as a fur trapper, and he just wasn't a great guy. Beaumont helped him financially and medically. Without him, he would have been long dead. But also, Alexis was a man with his own rights outside of the medical experiment, and I can imagine it got very taxing being experimented on every single day. If Alexis agreed to this arrangement in the first place, was Beaumont doing any wrong? This did all lead to huge medical advancements, and how long would it have been until people realised this if it wasn't for Beaumont and Alexis St Martin? Apparently Alexis did try to leave many times over the years, but he always came back. And rumour has it that Beaumont wasn't actually the biggest fan of Alexis, calling him a drunkard and a villain, even ungrateful. It was all just very insensitive. Beaumont was not happy when Alexis left in 1834 to go back to his family in Canada, and they never saw each other again despite Beaumont's efforts. For number 3, we have Unit 731, which wasn't necessarily an experiment within itself, but instead a covert biological and chemical warfare research and development unit of the Imperial Japanese Army. Any number of horrifying human experiments happened within the walls of these buildings, located in Harbin, China. Unit 731 was originally created in 1937 as an agency to promote public health, to benefit Japanese soldiers by learning more about the ways in which the human body could withstand hunger, thirst, and disease. Tests were conducted primarily on prisoners of war, Chinese and Russian prisoners, along with some Mongolian, Korean, and the occasional European prisoner. The main focus of Unit 731, it later transpired, was biological warfare. Although the 1925 Geneva Accords had banned biological and chemical warfare, the Japanese kind of wanted to be prepared apparently. The leader of the unit was Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, who experimented by infecting test subjects with all different kinds of diseases to see how their bodies would respond to pathogens. They would then inject different germs to see how they would react with each other in the body, in what seems like an attempt to maybe create new diseases. They would then perform all kinds of test procedures on the live subjects, who they referred to as logs or wooden logs, which was apparently a joke because the buildings were a former lumber mill. The subjects were not human in the experimenters' eyes. They even tested through pregnancy and rape, telling male prisoners who were infected with syphilis to rape both male and female prisoners to see how syphilis spreads. Sometimes when a woman got pregnant, she would be vivisected to see how the fetus was developing. Everything that went on in Unit 731 was absolutely horrifying. At one point, they even released rats infected with the bubonic plague amongst the prisoners, with the intention of infecting them so they could be studied. The Japanese terminated the unit after they formally surrendered from the war in 1955, and they destroyed most of the unit's records surrounding Unit 731 at the end of the war, so we don't know loads of information about what went on there. I'm sure there were even more horrific experiments took place, but we'll never know. Of course, the whole thing was incredibly top secret, and the only reason we know anything at all is because the Chinese government took it upon themselves to spread awareness of the atrocities committed against the Chinese people, alongside others. There's now a museum in Unit 731 to ensure that these atrocities are not forgotten. No one involved in this was ever punished for their crimes, and the American government decided not to put workers of 731 on trial. I'm not sure what jurisdiction they would have had there, I didn't actually look into that, but they might have had some jurisdiction. But they didn't decide to do this because instead they granted them immunity in exchange for the information they'd gathered during the experiments. Yep, that's correct. And whilst we're on the subject of crazy things the American government have done, we've got Project Artichoke, the name of a mind control experiment conducted in the USA in 1952. The project which eventually led to Project MKUltra, which I'm not even going to attempt to cover in today's video. Project Artichoke was an at the time top secret experiment conducted by the CIA, along with help from the intelligence divisions of the Army, Navy, Air Force and FBI. The aim was to research interrogation methods, and the project was originally outlined in a memo dated January 1952 with a question: can we get control of an individual to the point where he will do our bidding against his will and even against fundamental laws of nature, such as self-preservation? Artichoke was a cryptonym used for the study and/or use of special interrogation methods that have been known to include the use of drugs and chemicals, hypnosis, and total isolation, a form of psychological harassment. In 1949 to 1950, the CIA experimented with drugs and hypnosis in a project called Bluebird. This project eventually led to Artichoke, which took it all one step further, and then MKUltra, which took it even further. I don't think I need to point out all of the ethical questions surrounding this type of project, mind control. They carried out in-house and overseas experiments using a number of drugs to begin with: cocaine, marijuana, peyote, mescaline, but they found that LSD showed the most promising results. One of the plus sides of this experiment was that the subjects would get so drugged up that they wouldn't even really be able to remember what happened, so there was less of a security risk there. In 1952, LSD was given unknowingly to CIA agents to determine its effects on completely unsuspecting people. One officer was kept on LSD for a total of 77 days. They also studied hypnosis and forced morphine addiction and subsequent withdrawal, and total isolation to see the effects that this could have on control and interrogation. The hypnosis experiments were apparently conducted with staff volunteers used as subjects in several different 100 experiments, but no record was ever actually located which reflected hypnosis being used as an actual operational tool in the field. There was one incident from November 1953 which actually isn't clear if it was part of Project Artichoke or not, but it did involve the use of LSD as an experimental exercise. A man called Frank Olson, who was a civilian employee of the Army, committed suicide a week after having been administered LSD by an agency representative. The drug was administered to several unwitting subjects by a Dr. Gottlieb, who was the branch chief in the Office of Technical Services, who it seems did very much know of Artichoke, so may well have been part of this experiment. The test subjects weren't told they'd been given LSD until after the fact. Olson then began to behave very strangely the next day and was placed under the care of a psychiatrist. Just a few days later, he jumped through a window of a New York hotel in what was thought to be a case of suicide. Rumour even has it that at one point they conducted an experiment on an 8-year-old girl who underwent 6 months of treatment with LSD, electroshock and sensory deprivation. This 8-year-old girl ended up losing her memory and her brain became similar to that of a newborn's. Documents show that on the back of this all, it wasn't long until the Artichoke teams were dispatched overseas to handle a number of sensitive cases. On the 22nd of January 1954, the Artichoke team reported on what seemed to be their first proper assignment, writing that they were to attempt to answer a hypothetical problem. Can an individual of redacted descent be made to perform an act of attempted assassination involuntarily under the influence of Artichoke? It was proposed that an individual of redacted descent, approximately 35 years old, well educated, proficient in English, and well established socially and politically in the redacted government, be induced under Artichoke to perfect an act involuntarily of attempted assassination against a prominent redacted politician, or if necessary, against an American official. This really makes me laugh because at the bottom of this official report there's just an asterisk with a handwritten note saying, "Simulation only. Sure, Jan." The subject of this was a man who was a heavy drinker apparently, and it was thought that the drug could just be put into a cocktail at a party, and then the subject would be induced to perform the act of attempted assassinations at a later date. The conclusion of this experiment came back as apparently just a straight no, this wouldn't work, for 3 main reasons. 1, the subject would be involuntary and unwitting. 2, they would have no or very limited physical control and custody of the subject. And 3, access to the subject is strictly limited to a social engagement with mixed group of both cleared and uncleared personnel. So basically everything about this proposed simulation experiment was just wrong, it wasn't going to work, but surely they would have known that going into it. So basically they concluded that it wouldn't work, but also if they needed it to work, then they'd do it anyway. There's a handwritten note at the bottom of this sort of paper reading, "This would be made available when and if required." Eventually, Artichoke ended and merged into other CIA projects, but this is really something they tried to do, mind control, and I'm sure is probably ongoing still. The Little Albert experiment is one that involved the use of a 9-month-old boy who, for the purposes of the experiment, was called Albert, to show that infants can be conditioned to fear, similarly to how Pavlov had previously been able to condition dogs. The experiment was conducted by behaviourist John B. Watson and graduate student Rosalie Rayner, and intended to answer 3 questions. 1, can an infant be conditioned to fear an animal that appears simultaneously with a loud, fear-arousing sound? 2, would such fear transfer to other animals or inanimate objects? And 3, how long would such fears persist? Albert was just an infant, and therefore he was unable to consent to his part in the study. But there's also question over whether even his mother gave consent to him being involved. Some sources state that Albert's mother worked at Johns Hopkins as a wet nurse where the experiments took place, and that she was poor and struggling and agreed for her son to take part in the experiments in exchange for money. Other sources say this all took place without her knowledge, that Albert was just taken from the daycare in the hospital, I suppose, and was experimented on. The experiments began when he was just 9 months old, and it was actually all recorded. You can find the recording on YouTube if you want to go have a look. Watson started by introducing Albert to a number of furry animals, a dog, a rabbit, and a white rat. Albert showed no fear initially, but then the next time he was exposed to the rat, Watson made a loud noise by hitting a metal pipe with a hammer. Albert, scared, began to cry. After repeating this process several times, Albert started to cry whenever he saw the white rat, anticipating a horrible, loud noise. They noted, the instant the rat was shown, the baby began to cry. Almost instantly, he turned sharply to the left, fell over on his left side, raised himself on all fours, and began to crawl away so rapidly that he was caught with difficulty before reaching the edge of the table. It took only 2 sessions, just 1 week apart, for Albert to now be terrified of the rat, whether there was a noise or not. And then they discovered that Albert started to develop phobias of objects which shared characteristics with the rat, including the family dog, a fur coat, some cotton wool, and even a Father Christmas mask. The fear became generalised. Over the next few weeks, it was found that slowly Albert's fear of the rat became lesser, it started to die out. But by repeating the process, his fear would come back as strong as it did before. But by the time that he was around 1 year old, Albert's mother removed him from the experiment, which we've just realised suggests that she probably did know, she probably was aware of what was going on. Perhaps some might not think this experiment was a big deal, but this one actually really bothered me. Maybe it's because I've been diagnosed with generalised anxiety disorder since I was not much older than Albert. I was a toddler, and I have very specific phobias which control so many aspects of my life. So I personally just think it's so wrong to train a baby's brain like that. Like, if I'd been subject to an experiment like this, I'm not sure I'd be able to be a functioning human being. I can only hope that Albert grew up to be unaffected by all of this and not have a fear of anything white and fluffy. Nowadays, with a well-developed code of ethics in place, this experiment just wouldn't happen. Some of the cardinal rules of psychological research now are do no harm and the principle of informed consent. If you remember a while back, I made a whole video on the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment, in which the US government observed untreated syphilis in black men for a number of years, under the guise that they were receiving free healthcare. They were never told they had syphilis. The Guatemalan syphilis study has very similar vibes to that. Running from 1946 to 1948, the United States government engaged in a research experiment in which thousands of Guatemalan people were intentionally infected with bacteria that cause sexually transmitted diseases. The subjects were uninformed and never consented. These experiments were led by John Cutler, who also participated in the late stages of the Tuskegee experiments as well. This one went one step further than Tuskegee though. Instead of finding people who are already infected and just not telling them they're infected, they purposefully infected Guatemalan subjects. The subjects in Guatemala were mostly prisoners, military conscripts and sex workers, injected with syphilis, gonorrhea and chancroid in order to test penicillin, which was still in its fairly early days. More than half of the subjects were low-ranking soldiers, and it was originally arranged for infected sex workers to have sex with the subjects, but they soon realised it was just quicker and more reliable to inject them instead. But not only were subjects grown adults, orphaned children were also selected to be injected. Children. They were never ever given a chance to say no, to object to what was going on. It was never explained to these kids. They were just injected with life-changing diseases. 1,500 people were said to be affected by this, and only 87% of those infected with syphilis actually went on to receive the treatment for it. They lost track of the remaining 13%, and 10% of those who did receive treatment experienced reoccurrences. And not only were the subjects of the infections directly affected, those whose treatments didn't work or failed went on to have families and children of their own. There's potentially hundreds or even thousands of children and grandchildren descendants who would have been affected by this illness decades later. And why did the USA government do all of this, I hear you ask? Because they anticipated US soldiers coming back from overseas at the end of the war infected with any number of STDs, and they wanted to be able to treat them. That was it, because US soldiers being sick with venereal diseases would affect the military, and they couldn't have that. The Guatemalan people were seen as less important than the American people, and they would receive no apology at all until 2010, when President Obama apologised to the Guatemalan president and the people who were affected. This whole experiment was kept under wraps for 6 decades. They knew it would be controversial at the time, and even though the 1940s had lax laws around morals and things like this, it doesn't mean that people were clueless as to how bad it was. They would have known they were doing something bad. Even John Cutler wrote in a letter in 1947 saying, and I quote, "Unless the law winks occasionally, you have no progress in medicine." And to top it all off, the study yielded 0 useful information in the end. This was all for nothing. I'll definitely be doing a full video on this at some point in the future, so please keep an eye out for that. This one made me so angry. In the early 2000s, the UK government released a report on Britain's very own biological weapon trials between 1940 and 1979. Many of these trials involved releasing potentially dangerous chemicals and microorganisms over large amounts of the population without them ever being told, in more than 750 secret operations. We're going to talk about the Porton Downs experiments. Porton Downs was set up in 1916 at the height of World War I as a top-secret chemical weapons centre located near Salisbury, Wiltshire in England, on about 7,000 acres of land. In the majority, or maybe all of the cases, the trials didn't actually include real biological weapons, but alternatives which scientists believe would mimic germ warfare. Except this was the 1940s when they started doing this, and they didn't know as much about toxic chemicals and potential carcinogens as we do nowadays. Around 4,600 kilos of zinc cadmium sulfide was spread from ships, aircrafts and moving lorries from 1953 to 1964. In one example, planes flew from the northeast of England to the tip of Cornwall, all along the south and west coasts, dropping huge amounts of zinc cadmium sulfide on the population as it went. They wanted to watch as this chemical drifted inland to sort of learn about the movement of such things, and its fluorescence was so easy to follow. And whilst the government insists to this day that the chemical was safe, cadmium is highly recognised as a big cause of lung cancer, and during World War II the Allies even considered using it as a chemical weapon. And here they were, dropping a variant of it on the unwitting UK population. They didn't tell anyone they were doing this. And then there was a time in the 1960s when more than 1 million people along the south coast, from Torquay to the New Forest, were exposed to E. coli and Bacillus globigii, maybe, which very closely mimics anthrax, after they were sprayed from a military ship anchored off the coast. And then in 1956 there were the London Tube experiments, in which they released bacteria onto the Northern Line between Collier's Wood and Tooting Broadway through the ventilation systems. Apparently they wanted to test the vulnerability of the public transport systems to attack. And they found that bacteria they released travelled about 10 miles in the tunnel. Between 1964 and 1973 they attached germs to spiders' webs to see how the germs would survive in different environments. They then placed these webs across the country to see the effect. Fairly recently, the Ministry of Defence has been looking into the safety of these tests, and they have reported that there was apparently no risk to the public health. But many people can test this, including families from the areas most affected, whose children were born with disabilities, physical and mental. The public were treated as unwitting guinea pigs for years, and I suppose the government are just lucky there's been no actual proof of any health effects this had. But it seems that even to this day there's not enough data about the toxicity of zinc cadmium sulfide, so we don't really know for sure. And to round this video up, we have the Aversion Project, a medical torture program that took place during apartheid in South Africa. This was led by a man called Dr. Aubrey Levin, who claimed that he had found the cure for homosexuality in the form of electroshock therapy. This project identified gay soldiers in the South African Defence Forces. Now, there was actually a policy at the time which prohibited permanent members of the force being gay, but if you were a conscript, or basically a member of the draft, it was permitted, but I can't imagine it was particularly well liked to be gay. They essentially didn't want to give gay men an excuse to avoid military service. The national service was compulsory. The SADF considered homosexuality to be subversive, and although it was allowed or tolerated technically to be gay, you would be punished for it. Throughout the 70s and 80s in South Africa, thousands of gay men had to involuntarily undergo electric shock therapy, hormone treatment, and chemical castration, alongside a number of lesbian women as well. The electroshock treatment, including strapping electrodes to the subject's upper arms attached to a dial. The gay men were then shown pictures of a naked man and encouraged to fantasize about them. Meanwhile, the power is slowly being turned up until they could take no more. Then you are shown an image of a naked woman or told to think about a woman or your girlfriend. And the same stood for lesbians, just the other way round. I cannot stress the power of these shocks enough. One psychologist described shocks so extreme that the subject's shoes would fly off, and when she raised this concern, she was just removed from the team. And that's bad enough, but this isn't where the project stopped. If these so-called rehabilitations failed, the soldiers would then be forced to go through with a gender reassignment procedure, which most often would be left incomplete. The doctors had very little care for these men. They were gay, they didn't count as humans. They just essentially wanted to eradicate homosexuality entirely, which of course didn't work even a little bit. It did, however, have extremely detrimental effects on the soldiers' mental and physical health, and a huge amount of them would go on to commit suicide as a result of this. These men were given no control over their own bodies, they didn't give informed consent to go through any of these procedures, and they were treated as if they were inhuman. There was no respect, they were just abused repeatedly. And although this did take place in South Africa, this was actually something which took place all around the world, just not on such a huge scale. Homosexuality was listed in the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders as a mental illness. So doctors justified treating it in this way because it was an illness, it needed fixing. And Levin didn't stop with homosexuality either. He argued that the same procedures could be used for drug addicts and the disturbed, aka just people who didn't want to serve in the military. That made you disturbed. He was even warned that what he was doing was a literal violation of human rights, but he claimed that all of the patients were volunteers, so it was fine. They were not volunteers, they were very much unwilling and coerced. In 1995, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission report from South Africa said that Levin was one of the abusers of human rights. And quickly as you know it, he emigrated to Canada to evade capture. In Canada, he got a licence to practice as a psychiatrist and worked there until his licence was suspended in 2010. And it was only suspended after a male patient filmed him making unwitting sexual advances. In total, 30 men came forward claiming they'd been sexually assaulted by Levin during their counselling sessions. Oh, there are so many things I could say about that, but all I'll say is I bet he never put himself through his electroshock therapy. He said that he never realised that what he was doing was a criminal act in Canada because it was allowed in South Africa. He was eventually convicted of sexual assault and was given a 5-year sentence, but he's never ever paid for his human rights violations. That is still apparently fine. So there you go, 8 cases of insane and incredibly unethical human experiments. I'm already preempting the comments I'm going to get down below about, what about this experiment, or how dare you not include that experiment? This is just a few out of hundreds of insane experiments I could have spoken about. If you want to see another video with even more, then you know what to do. Comment down below and let me know. Thank you so much for watching this video, and a huge thank you to HelloFresh for sponsoring. Please check them out in the top line of the description box down below for 10 free meals. I'm actually waiting on another box to turn up any moment now, so I'm very excited. I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.